Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. Donald Trump vowed to deport millions of people living in the United States, most of them Mexican. Many will return to a country they barely know. What kinds of challenges will they face? And what happens to families on both sides of the border? We'll be talking about the dilemma of the deportees with the leader of a new binational organization created to provide support and to fight back. Stay tuned. To talk about returning migrants to Mexico, we're very pleased to have with us today in the studio Marco Castillo. Marco, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Laura. What a pleasure to be here.
Marco is the director of Transnational Villages Network, a new organization that helps returning migrants here in Mexico. Marco, Trump has promised to deport massive numbers of migrants. Are you seeing an increase in the number of migrants returning here to Mexico, and what kind of challenges do they face?
Well, I would say that we're seeing an increase in fear. People who are returning because they're afraid of what could eventually happen to them.
So we're talking about voluntary returns?
Voluntary returns. And what we are also seeing is that the government, specifically the Trump administration, is investing in growing the infrastructure in the border to be able to deport more people. So far they haven't done it, but eventually we're going to see a growth in that. Still, last year we had 151,000 people who were deported. So, I mean, that's probably a little less than a half for what we used to have years ago, but still, it's a lot of people. It's each of those individuals face several challenges to start a life in a country that most of them don't feel familiar with anymore.
Because they've been gone
in the United States for almost an average a decade.
That's an average?
Yes, yes. So that represents a lot of challenges for people who definitely feel more U.S. Citizens than Mexican in different levels.
Culture shock, despite the fact that their origins are Mexican.
Yes, not to mention how difficult it is in Mexico to navigate a system like a local government. And if you don't have a form of ID or a birth certificate, because most of the deportations happen, suddenly, and people are not prepared for that, and having to start a life without a document, it's shocking. It's something that can definitely lead to severe depression or taking the risk of falling in problematic consumption and addictions. And yes, it's definitely something that as a Mexican society and the Mexican government specifically haven't really take a serious look at.
Well, can you tell us, to put a human face on this, give us a typical story of someone you've seen recently who's had to return, whether voluntarily for fear or deported by the U.S. government?
Sure. A mother, a father who suddenly finds himself, herself in a city that they don't know. For example, Mexico City. We've been getting 3 charter flights a week. So here in Mexico City, we receive a lot of those returnees. So a mother and a father who finds herself in Mexico City without networks, without no one to call to, and still under the shock of being detained and the whole deportation process, and having no idea how to start and navigate and figure it out, where to stay. And first problem is, how can you prove that you're Mexican?
You mean they don't, even the planes don't have the...
Yes, if you don't have a form of ID, a national, a government-issued ID, then it's a problem. Then you're nobody.
Well, at some point, the U.S. government decided they were Mexican.
Yes.
So the Mexican government kind of has to take that. I mean, somebody has to take these poor people.
Yes.
And
in terms of the deportation procedure, definitely nationality has been proven. But when you start a life in society like Mexico City or anywhere else, if you don't have with yourself a form of ID, then you're in trouble.
So this is a pretty widespread problem.
Yes, and now
not having documents.
Yes,
they're undocumented in all countries.
Yes, many of them, if not most of them, get a certificate of deportation, and
that's kind of sad to be your only identity.
Yes, issued by the Mexican government, and they use it to start a, get their first form of ID, but at the same time, it has taken us a lot of time to get, for example, in Mexico we don't have an official national ID. The only thing that we have is the electoral, and still we have a lot of troubles for that agency, the INE, to accept the deportation certificate as a form to get a national ID. And some others bring their passports or another ID that the Mexican consulate provides in the U.S., but the local government in Mexico won't recognize it because they don't know it. So they take it as if it was a false ID. So yes, if you don't have a birth certificate, you cannot prove your name. Many IDs that are being issued here in the city or in the country require a birth certificate. Oof. So it's very difficult. People can, find themselves stranded for 15 days with no form of ID and sleeping in the streets. No one's going to give you a home,
literally
a place to stay.
Streets.
No one's going to rent you anything or give you a job if you don't have that.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's just the first challenge. For us, one of the most important, it's the emotional level of it. I mean, the stress that it represents, deportation and finding themselves. It's very hard for people to start a life when they're thinking, when their hearts are still in the U.S. with their loved ones, where they left a home or car,
or
jobs, savings, money in the bank, children. So definitely, people are not okay, and so it's very hard for us to help people to start a life when there's such trauma.
Is the government helping out at all? I mean, you've talked about this barrier in terms of just getting basic identity documents. Are they providing other kinds of services? What's available to these people?
Yes, the government has been doing some changes in legislation and some of their practices in order to facilitate people to access to school, education, or even to forms of ID. Still, it's definitely not enough. I repeat myself, when people who have no networks, you definitely need much more than that. For example, can you imagine someone who really doesn't speak Spanish?
Yeah, I bet there are.
To begin with, communicate, it's very hard. The Mexican government has no shelters infrastructure. They don't have a program where they provide immediate housing for someone who's been deported. So most of people, no. So most deported start by living in the streets or staying in bus terminals or the airport, and until they find someone who help them or an old relative or someone that they would remember.
And these are people who had a job and a home and a family in the United States for maybe decades.
Yes, definitely.
So it's not just a question of how do you assimilate these returning people, but there's a very strong violation of rights to uproot people in their lives in this way.
Yes, it's going to be very hard for someone who doesn't want to leave in the country that he or she's been sent to accept and assimilate, this new form of life. And so most of them end up finding a basic job with a very basic income, but with high levels of depression, and just waiting for a moment to, try it again and go back to the U.S. So that's one of the the poor analysis that both of our governments, Mexico and the US, have made around the deportation process and investing so much in getting people safe to Mexico, when in reality people are again risking their lives to try it again. And in the end, they're going to try to go back.
With even harsher
Yes.
consequences
Yes,
than
definitely.
before. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's really tough for the adults mostly who are arriving here, oftentimes alone and without contacts. But you, in transnational villages, work with families on both sides of the border. What happens to children who are left behind?
Yes. Children who are left behind definitely face as much challenges as their parents who are being sent to Mexico. Many of them, if their parents didn't leave a parental consent to someone else to take care of them, could be just taken
legal
into
document.
Child Protective Services and find themselves in a shelter or being giving into a family,
A foster
family,
home
a
or
foster
something.
home,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that represents a huge stress. Many parents, for example, find it very difficult, even though they have the right to fight for parental custody after they've been sent. The legislation in the US allows people to participate through Skype or other forums where they can, present their arguments. And the truth is that it's very difficult. That almost doesn't happen. So it's very hard for you to fight your right and say, here, I am president, I want to keep my kids with me. It's very hard. And most of the judges in the US consider Mexico to be a not safe place for children, for US citizens, for US children. So in the end, and they almost never give custody to their parents. So in many cases, deportation means losing your kids.
Oh, you mean they can't
children.
even take their children back with them if they choose to in some cases?
If they choose no, when you're deported, you're not going to be taken with your family. You're just going to be taking yourself. And then if you have a conflict with your partner or someone who stays with them,
You won't get custody.
it's going to be very hard for you to fight custody. It's very few cases where a judge has been granted custody to someone who is in Mexico.
Have you seen cases where children are actually put in foster homes or into the child services?
Yes.
Of all ages?
Yes, we've worked with that. Yes, not only children, but on the other hand, youth who's being deported. Can you imagine people who could have applied for DACA who didn't? And they arrived to the US when they were 1 year, 2 years old, and then at the age of 20, they realize that they're not US citizens, and then they're sent back to a country that they've never been. It's very hard.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned DACA too, because it's been in the headlines so much. It almost did actually cause a government shutdown for a few days, and will be coming up again until it gets resolved. There seems to be a high degree of sympathy in the United States and society for the DACA students and workers. They're saying they always use the phrase through no fault of their own, they're in the United States. But why haven't we heard more about the other people who are affected in these ways? The children who are being left behind. Why is the sympathy focused, rightfully so, on the DACA students, but doesn't extend to this broader problem?
For those of us who work with families on both sides of the border, it was very unfortunate since years ago when President Obama proposed it to separate those kids from their families and trying to introduce a piece of legislation. And up to this day, we've been still paying the consequences of this, that we think that it's linked to an unnecessary nationalistic view, when in reality the parents of most of those DACA kids have been in the US for as long as these DACA kids and contributed with as much as their kids have been contributing. Not to mention that they were responsible for the education of these kids, and if DACA kids today represent a promise for a better America, it's also because of their parents and their investment, who under very, very difficult conditions provided for education and for them. So it's very sad to see that now the American public is seen in a separate way, when in reality both parents and kids love the country in the same way, and they've given it a lot.
There have been some really tragic testimonies from DACA beneficiaries saying, now what do I do? I mean, even if I get to stay, I have to watch my parents be forced out of the country.
Exactly.
You know, and so and there's a movement for a clean DACA, but the political situation is just closing in on them from all sides.
Yes, it's sad to see how the value of family that was so much part of the idea of you know, a better or a United States of America.
And of the right wing,
yes,
which is now in power.
Yes, it's how it is vanishing, and now seems like people's not caring about family and separating a parent from a kid, and destroying, you know, families, destroying communities. Families are the core of a, you know, a society, of a community, and so if you have separated families, you're going to have difficult, you know, societies and communities that you're going to have to deal with a lot of trouble with.
Yeah, there's so many problems. I mean, we know this, that the studies of crime and other social problems, so many of them go back to the childhood of the individuals involved. And obviously, I'm not saying that these immigrants are going to become criminals, but you're just creating a situation when children can't grow up in safe and healthy families to generate a whole series of problems. No one seems to be thinking about that.
Sure. Mexican, Central American families in the United States of America are ones with the lowest rates of, you know, of crimes and trouble, and when you separate them, then you have kids who are, you know, left by themselves under challenging circumstances. You're offering them a future of you know, of violence, and so I agree with you. You just create conditions for violence to grow in the United States.
Your organization, Transnational Villages, and other organizations have been working on a special program of family reunification, or a special program of at least bringing families together that haven't seen each other for a long time. And I've seen some of the films of this, and that moment is really moving and obviously of a deep emotional impact on the people involved. Could you describe that program?
Sure. We believe that migration is much more than jobs. Migration is much more than people crossing so-called border to provide their, you know, their workforce in another country, but it's also a movement of culture, movement of ideas, you know, movement of colors or tastes. And so,
that migrants are human beings?
Definitely.
What a radical idea, Marco.
Can you imagine? 2017 sounds like. Well, so what we've been doing is we've been working with the communities of those who are in the United States. We're working with the communities of origin, with their mothers, with their parents, with their kids who stay in Mexico, and try to help them come up with projects that embrace and represent the best of the communities that they live in. And once a year, we bring them to the States to show the beauty of the culture of many migrants that are living in the United States. Most of them are indigenous and from you know, a long tradition that includes food, dances, dress, all kinds of things that are enriching the U.S. culture every day, and they're not very visible because people are very scared of showing who they are because they've been forced to live in the darkness. So through this cultural program, we've been able to bring together communities who've been separated from each other for decades, you know. Sometimes they're related, sometimes they're not, but just bridging, you know, origin and destination through culture, and so it's been an opportunity for us to bring more than 150 women, mostly, to go and showcase their work and their culture in the United States, and then go back to Mexico. I remember that decades ago, people was very they wouldn't believe that this would be possible, and today no less than 7 state governments in Mexico are replicating this model, and so every year thousands of mostly women and elders are are going to the U.S.
And showcasing Mexican culture in Mexican communities, but in the United States.
Yes.
Well, that can be a wedge against racism, too.
Yes, exactly. For example, through this festival, when it comes to, dancing or eating, we found ourselves like the same between white, brown, black, red, all colors we find ourselves enjoying, and the same way food, and forgetting for a second how these bad politics have taken us into this point of hate among each other.
Is this part of the concept? Probably a lot of people aren't familiar with this concept of transnational villages.
Yes.
And especially now that there's been a hardening of the border, there's a return to nationalist sentiments in the United States as well as white supremacy. How would you describe this concept of transnational villages, and what's the strategy that you're building there?
Yes. Mexicans migrate to the U.S. just like many other generations of countries have migrated in the U.S. from Europe decades, hundreds of years ago. But the difference is that Mexico and the U.S. are so close that you never actually are gone from your country. So Mexican communities have the ability and the opportunity to be so close to their home country that there's a lot of back and forward, a lot of people who bring food, send back clothing, and that's what we call, translocalism, transnationalism. The idea of living in two places at the same time, having an identity that represents the best of both places. And
before, when it used to be easier to cross the border, we actually saw much more kind of circular migration, going up, working for a while, coming back, going back to work for a while.
Yes.
Now people get frozen in a little bit more into where they are because of the difficulty in crossing. But it's certainly been a phenomenon for a long time between the United States and Mexico.
We are absolutely sure that that's the way that it's going to be. There's no way to stop this from happening. The waves of migration throughout the world have pointed out that in the coming decades, the new generation of kids who are like children of migrants are going to have no less than 2 or 3 passports. So there's going to be millions of people every generation. There's more and more people who are able to move from a country to another and experience and live under transnationality. And so we see this as a migrants are showing us the way that the world is going, and governments are very, very, very slow in realizing how this is the way that we as a global community live. And so it's been very slow in many cases, just like in the U.S.
Not just slow, but
against
blocking
violent, blocking it. But in the end, for example, between U.S. and Mexico, there's 20 million kids who are U.S., Mexico-U.S. citizens, and
20 million.
And then they're eventually in the coming decades they're going to be just like moving back and forward, And so you can do whatever you want. You're trying to punish the current migrant community, but in the coming generations, it's just like something that it's going to be impossible to stop. So why don't you just accept it and embrace it and create conditions for people to, embrace and live under transnational circumstances, contributing to both countries in the same way and bring in the best of both.
Well, that sounds like a much more positive view of the future and the future of migration than we've been hearing lately. And I think one of the most positive aspects is what you've described today, the organization of and by the migrants themselves. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.